With the few minutes that we've got left before lunch, we're very close to that time. I want to try and sneak in just a few questions. And one, I think, goes to both Bill and Ian, because it seems to me that there is a similar large question that comes from both, and that is, whenever there is conflict between environmental issues, biodiversity issues and economic issues and economic development, even within a country, even within a region, even within a council area, you will have conflict and you'll have competing priorities. You're talking about a global scale. So, and Ian, you talked about protecting marine biodiversity requires a global framework, but there has been a lack of process. My question to both of you, and Bill, I'm curious to know what kind of response would please you out of your Nature article, and to both of you, where does all this lead? I mean, you're talking about different problems in different countries. You'd say easily, oh, well, it just goes back to the United Nations. You know, it's got to be dealt with on a kind of global scale. What's your response broadly to that, Bill?
Well, it's a gigantic challenge. What we would like to see, and is in fact we are beginning to see, is people trying to take this approach and these kind of large-scale perspectives that come from a global analysis and to then integrate them into much more intensive local analyses so that you can use them for real-world road planning. So, for instance, we've recently just started partnerships with somebody doing this for Borneo, for the whole island of Borneo. Somebody else is doing it for Zambia. We ourselves are looking at 29 major development corridors that are currently being planned for sub-Saharan Africa. And Rio Tinto contacted us recently and asked us if we'd be interested in working with them for planning I think if I remember right, it's either a 650-kilometer long railway in West Africa and the impacts of that. So what is happening right now, quite honestly, in many cases, is economists and economic forces and regional planners and transportation planners are dominating many of these conversations, and I don't think that the environmental side of this, and certainly the big picture environmental side of this, has had enough of a role at the table. And it's not just boxes. We get this mindset, oh, we just got to tick a few little environmental boxes and it'll all be fine. There are places in the world where roads really should not go. And there are places in the roads where existing roads probably should be closed. Those are some pretty tough realities, and this is the kind of nature of debate that probably needs to happen if we're not going to just see an overwhelming loss of natural values across the world. And so, again, societies, sovereign nations will be having these debates. We're just hoping to see the environmental interests, I guess it were, or the environmental information having a real place at the table.
Ian?
First of all, I think we do need global, local, regional approaches, but I think those approaches, I'm a great believer in standards. So I think my argument, you need a standardised approach in terms of what you're assessing. But in answer to your question, I'd use an example from something I'm involved in Gladstone, right? The Gladstone, and many around this room be aware of the controversy around Gladstone, the recent Senate reports, and it's I think an absolute disaster area and so forth. And when you actually go and get involved in that, I think there's a couple of key elements, lessons learned. First of all, when you bring the groups together, so industry, government, community, Indigenous interest, the first thing is to get some agreement around, well, what the objectives, what is their goal, what they want. And quite interestingly, that was a process that took a little while, but it was a process that there was general agreement. And so once you've got that, then you convert that to some measurable objectives. So the measurable in terms of having a direction, also having a direction. And once you've done that, then you can come to some of the identification of indicators. So at least you're then having a debate about the same set of data. So you're removing some of the emotion, so it's not all of it, but in having had that agreed set of indicators and then an agreement on how you can measure them, I think then you can do two things, both come up with a assessment of the status, and you can then relate that back to the drivers. You can also think about, well, what you might want to do about it, implement, and where there's agreement, implement intervention, but also having had this standard approach, you can actually measure the effectiveness and come back and see how well you're going. So I think that's the sort of thing we need to do. But it's not just, and it may be a Gladstone scale, it may be a whole of the Great Barrier Reef scale, or it may be a Pacific Ocean scale. I think, but the same approach is the same. You might have a few more or a few more specific indicators at a local scale, but you'll have an agreed set that you'd measure across all those scales.
Scientists, of course, mainstream scientists took a fair old slathering in the course of the climate change debate as that has come to a head at the beginning of this century. And I think many didn't quite retire hurt from the field, but you got the sense were sort of puzzled and hurt that people weren't prepared to sit down and listen as they carefully explained that the voice of science somehow got lost in the equation. And I just wonder whether either or both of you feel how you feel about that in terms of your own fields and your own quite, in some ways, alarming concerns. That nations and regions, in terms of trying to order their priorities, sometimes politicians will listen to the loudest voice. What's your response to that?
I think scientists need to probably elevate our volume level and probably be prepared to engage. You know, we have this traditional way of communicating, which is publishing things in scientific journals, and then we think we've done our job and go home and have a beer and everything's fine and well. I don't think that's clearly doing enough. And as a journalist, Kerry, you also know that the paradigm of journalism is always, you could have 999 scientists with one point of view and 2 scientists with a different point of view, and the paradigm is often, I'm not blaming journalists, but I'm saying the paradigm is to hear both perspectives. And it's quite well known in the climate change literature that there's this gigantic difference between what scientists think and in terms of the proportions that are worried about climate change or think it's a problem, and what the public perceives. And one of the issues has been this approach that journalists always present the other side of the story because it's just so embedded in their training and thinking. But there are some issues. Now, I actually think there's still plenty of things we don't know about climate change, but nobody let's say nobody, but very few mainstream scientists don't think it's not happening. There's lots of questions about what it's going to do and how bad it's going to get. And those are legitimate questions, and we can't sweep that under the carpet. But I think we have scientists as a group need to do a better job at communicating. Some people are starting to pick that up, but you know, the most influential scientists are the ones who are making that transition into trying to communicate.
Very,
very quick response, Ian, because I want to give Jason.
Yes, one initial comment is, I think the robustness of the assessments is there. So I wouldn't, and I think, but I would say that similar to what Bill said, I think the approach taken to communicate that, particularly communicating uncertainty, which is very important to science, but creates confusion. Was a problem. And I also think the process was too late in communicating or really focusing on what you might do about it. And I think what you might do about it is not a science question, that's an engagement question. I don't think we did that very well.
Okay. Now, Jason, some fantastic photographs there. We're starting to see that kind of greening process take place in Australia. But I wonder, how advanced if you could extrapolate from that, gee, this is happening around the world, that's exciting, but is it? I mean, did what we see represent a very small start?
It's curious. I mean, my 10 years of research, which started at Cambridge, was looking at sort of global greening. And what we can see is that first of all, we're not just talking about physical greenery, but we're also talking about the green agenda and sustainable development. And what we can see is far-reaching policies taking place in European governments, whereby there is a move towards zero-carbon development. If the city is consuming, if we see that carbon emissions are basically having the built environment contributing 50%, and then within that 50%, 80% is actually the carbon emissions from cities, it's no surprise that governments are trying to move towards a zero-carbon sort of series of policies. Now, in the UK, by 2016, all new residential developments will need to be carbon zero. By 2018, all new civic buildings will need to be carbon zero. in Germany, green roofs are the norm. You have to incorporate green roofs. What we're seeing is that governments globally are moving towards that trend. It's not just in sort of Southeast Asia, even though Singapore is a leader in terms of greening the urban habitat. But we are seeing, certainly in Germany, Denmark, in the UK, the prevalence of zero carbon development and also greening the rooftops to try and reduce ambient temperatures and rainwater runoff and so on and so forth. The fundamental is the stick and the carrot. And what you see in some of the European policies is that it has become legislated and it's a bit of a stick. In Asia, what we find quite interesting is that there is the economic incentive, and that's very much driven by urbanization, population increase, and just the need to try and now find those alternative pockets of greenery just to actually help cool the environment. I mean, it's hot. You know, Singapore, Manila, KL, Jakarta, these are hot environments. And the ability to incorporate greenery into these pockets within the city can actually help reduce ambient temperatures and therefore help reduce the energy consumption. So there are economic incentives by government to kind of say, you put these spaces in, you can actually build more area. And so in one case in Singapore, the second and third green building master plan for the city-state, basically says you incorporate these social spaces, you green those spaces, there will be immediate economic incentives by you being able to build more area. And there will also be some certain tax breaks if you start to embrace zero energy development and incorporate renewable energy sources.
Now, I'd love to go on, but we're already 10 minutes into our lunch period, so I'd suggest to you that you continue the conversation outside. I've got quite a few questions I'd love to have asked you, Jason, about where all that goes and the way equity is applied and so on. But that's for out there now. We've got Joe. We're going to hear from Joe Hockey when we come back, and then we have another session. But for now, would you please thank our three panellists very much?